After the last mission ended, millions of helmets, weapons, and vehicles were left behind across continents. Nations faced mountains of abandoned gear with nowhere to store it and no clear plan. Some equipment vanished into the ocean forever. Other pieces reappeared in unexpected conflicts decades later. Certain items became everyday civilian tools. What happened next changed post-war history. The massive problem no one talks about. When the final mission of World War II ended in 1945, something unprecedented happened. Millions of helmets, weapons, vehicles, and gear were left scattered across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. We're not talking about a few thousand items. We're talking about millions of tons of equipment. Tanks set rusting in fields. Helmets piled up in abandoned camps. Entire supply depots stretched for miles, filled with uniforms, boots, and weapons. No nation had ever faced a problem this big before. There was no rulebook, no storage plan. The sheer amount of leftover gear was staggering enough to supply entire armies all over again. Governments stood at a crossroads. They had to make fast decisions about what to do with all of it, and what they chose to do next would shape the world for decades to come. The first solution, breaking it all down. The first and most obvious solution was simple: destroy it. But not in the way you'd think. Governments realized that all this metal, steel, and equipment could be used again, not as weapons, but as raw materials. Massive operations began across Europe and America. Heavy equipment like tanks, planes, and ships were sent to enormous strip-out yards. Workers pulled out anything still usable: engines, radios, parts that worked. Then the rest was melted down. Imagine entire fleets of aircraft reduced to molten steel, mountains of helmets tossed into furnaces. This wasn't just about getting rid of old gear, it was about rebuilding. War-torn cities needed steel for bridges, buildings, and factories. The very tools of destruction became the foundation for peace. But not everything was melted down. Some gear had a very different future waiting.
When military gear became civilian life. While heavy equipment was being scrapped, lighter gear found a surprising second life. Boots, uniforms, backpacks, tents, even vehicles like jeeps and trucks. Governments couldn't just throw all of it away, it was too valuable. So they sold it, cheap. This is how the concept of army surplus was born. In the United States, the War Assets Administration was created to manage the sale of colossal amounts of leftover material. Private companies, veterans, and everyday citizens could buy military gear for a fraction of the cost. Campers used army tents. Hikers wore combat boots. Businesses bought trucks that once carried troops into missions. Suddenly, the same gear that served on battlefields was now helping people rebuild their everyday lives. But while civilians were wearing old uniforms, entire nations were receiving something far more powerful: rearming allies in a new world. The mission might have ended, but peace didn't mean safety. A new tension was rising, the Cold War, and with it came an urgent question: how do you help friendly nations defend themselves? The answer was already sitting in warehouses. Instead of scrapping or selling all the leftover gear, the United States and Soviet Union began transferring massive amounts of equipment to allied countries. American helmets, weapons, and vehicles were shipped to nations across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East. Soviet surplus went to countries aligning with them. For decades, soldiers around the world wore American M1 helmets and carried weapons first used in World War II. Some of this gear served through the Korean conflict and even beyond. And then, there was the enemy's equipment, captured German and Japanese gear that met a very different fate. What happened to the enemy's gear? After the mission ended, Allied forces found themselves with another problem. What do you do with the enemy's leftover equipment? Captured German tanks, Japanese weapons, entire stockpiles seized after surrender. Most of it was destroyed or scrapped immediately. Governments didn't want it falling into the wrong hands. But here's where it gets interesting. Some of it wasn't destroyed. Out of necessity, certain nations, including Israel and countries formerly occupied by Axis powers, pressed captured equipment into service for their own defense. They had no choice. They needed gear fast, and this equipment was available. Even decades later, you could still find German weapons being used in places far from Europe. But the story doesn't end there. Some gear never made it to Allied nations or scrapyards. Instead, it simply disappeared. The gear that vanished into the ocean. Here's something most people don't know. After the mission ended, governments faced a massive logistical nightmare. Millions of rounds of ammunition, obsolete ships, and dangerous materials that couldn't be stored safely. The solution? Load it onto barges and dump it into the ocean. This wasn't a secret operation. It was official policy. Entire shipments of ammunition were pushed overboard into deep water. Old vessels were deliberately sunk. It was the fastest and cheapest way to get rid of massive amounts of material that no one wanted or could use. To this day, some of these underwater sites remain dangerous. Divers occasionally discover caches of old ammunition resting on the ocean floor, still potentially active. And while some equipment sank beneath the waves, other gear was simply left behind, buried and forgotten on the battlefields themselves. Abandoned and left behind. Not all equipment made it back home. On major battlefields, especially in remote areas across Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Pacific, caches of weapons, helmets, and gear were simply left where they fell. Sometimes it was too dangerous to retrieve. Other times it was buried deliberately to avoid the cost of transport. Even today, clearance teams are still finding these hidden stockpiles. Helmets buried in trenches, weapons sealed in bunkers, unexploded materials that remain hazardous decades later. Farmers in Europe occasionally uncover old gear while plowing fields. Construction crews stumble upon forgotten supply dumps. The process of clearing these sites continues, even now, more than 75 years after the mission ended. But some of this abandoned gear didn't stay buried. It resurfaced in the most unexpected places.
When old gear showed up in new conflicts. Here's where history takes a surprising turn. A significant amount of World War II equipment didn't just disappear or get scrapped. It showed up again in new conflicts. Weapons and vehicles originally used in the 1940s were pressed back into service during the Korean conflict in the 1950s, then in post-colonial struggles, then in civil conflicts across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Even today, World War II-era small arms occasionally surface in conflict zones. The German STG-44 assault rifle, a weapon first developed in the 1940s, has been discovered in the Middle East and Africa in recent years. Decades after being manufactured, these pieces of history continue to appear in the most unexpected corners of the world. But not all the gear ended up in conflict zones or at the bottom of the ocean. A small portion found a very different home, preserved for history. While most equipment was scrapped, sold, or reused, a small percentage was carefully preserved. Museums, historical collections, and military history enthusiasts saved helmets, uniforms, weapons, and vehicles for future generations. Today, you can walk into museums around the world and see the exact gear worn by those who served. These preserved items aren't just objects, they're physical connections to history. They tell stories of sacrifice, strategy, and survival. Collectors and historians work to ensure these pieces remain intact, so that decades, even centuries from now, people can still see and understand what happened during one of the most significant periods in human history. So the next time you see a World War II helmet in a museum, or spot an old military vehicle at a collector's show, remember, you're looking at one of the few survivors. Most of its companions were melted down, sold off, transferred overseas, dumped in the ocean, or lost to time. What remains is a small window into a massive moment that changed the world forever. The fate of abandoned equipment from battlefields remains one of history's most fascinating logistic stories. From helmets and weapons melted for rebuilding to relics still being discovered by searchers with metal detectors today, each piece tells part of a larger story. Captured enemy gear met various ends, some destroyed, others repurposed out of necessity. The salvage operations that followed reshaped nations and supplied conflicts for decades. Next time you wonder what happened to all that gear after the mission ended, remember, it didn't just vanish. It transformed the post-war world in ways we're still uncovering. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more untold history.